I do believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. I believe that we are live.
Well, then, hello, fans,
Fans, admirers.
liberty lovers,
Oh God.
lovers of liberty.
Oh, I should have known that was coming. I don't know why I set us up for that, because that hurts my soul.
Yeah, really puts a damper on the start of the show
Yeah, we might as well just start
for
over
Matthew.
now. As we're gonna log off and we're gonna come back on, and it's just gonna be me.
That's funny.
All right, so that looks like that's all correctamundo. We'll save that. Then we'll open that. Yeah, we're looking pretty spiffy today. My forehead's all shiny. I need makeup to get my forehead less shiny.
The nicest thing that anyone ever said to me, and it makes sense that it's a very California compliment, but she worked at like a coffee shop, and I walked in, and it was a few years ago. One day, she just goes, like the second I walked in the door, she goes, "Oh my God, did you get Botox? You look great." It was absolutely the best compliment anyone. And again, very California.
Very.
I think it was. I think maybe I had just like slept for 5 minutes, and it's just more of a testament to like what shit I usually look like. But yeah, that's pretty good. Did you get Botox? Just right away.
It's like I don't know. Is that like a backhanded compliment, or is that something that's meant to be taken as a legitimate compliment?
I I chose to take it as a legitimate compliment. It's stuck with me for years. And the only reason, actually, I just thought of it was because my chiropractor. I just saw my chiropractor. And it was the second nice thing anyone has ever said to me in my entire life. He walked in. He goes. So what have you been up to? What have you been doing? Did you get taller? Like he goes. He goes. What have you been doing? You look swole as fuck. Did you get taller? What are you taking? He said, what are you taking? Which is a very high compliment to me.
You're like many squats. That's what I'm taking.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you what I am taking to help me with those squats, Matthew.
What are you taking to help you with those squats?
Steroids. I'm kidding.
Oh, Carlos. Kidding. Carlos is selling us steroids.
Hey, Carlos, do you have any CBD flavored steroids?
When I get my steroids injected into my butt, I prefer them to be CBD flavored.
That's right.
Well, that's right. Speaking of CBD, we will do a quick shout out to our sponsor here. Thank you. There's someone in the world felt like it was worthwhile to sponsor us two goofballs here as we jabber away on stuff that 11 people on the planet care about. And that someone was our good friends Carlos and Vanessa Abelar over at Paloma Verde. You can go to palomaverdecbd.com and use our super special fancy dancy promo code KING, which will get you 25% off any order over $75. They just set up a new website over there. It looks really sharp. And actually, just before I came up here and sat down to record this show, I was feeling a little kind of wound up and strung out because the last several days, week or so, have been completely bonkers while I'm trying to get our two cars sold and this new pickup truck leased. And I'm scouring the entire country for just the right truck, and then being the father of a newborn and all this other stuff all at the same time it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of going from sun up to sundown, and so I was feeling a little kind of strung out, and so I went down and I actually I only did half of the CBD gummy. It's a strawberry lemonade flavored one. It's 10 milligrams per gummy, but I just did half of it to kind of take the edge off and wind down a little bit so we could do this show. And I'm feeling much better now. I'm just kind of chilled out. I'm ready to go. I feel focused and calm. And that was maybe 20 minutes ago or so. So they take effect pretty quickly. And then I this last order I placed, I got some of their soft gels, and the soft gels, oh my God, you take one of those before you go to sleep. I made the mistake of taking one maybe 2 or 3 hours before I was going to go to bed. We were just sitting down to watch a TV show, and I took one of their soft gels, and I was in another planet. I was just like sitting there trying to watch the TV show, just relaxed as all hell, just starting to drift off and having a hard time focusing. And It was absolutely perfect. So just take it just before you go to bed, and if you're maybe someone else could take it in the middle of the day and they would be just fine. But my system is such that I take it just before I go to bed, and I sleep like a corpse. The best sleep ever. I have very vivid dreams. I guess so. Corpses don't usually have vivid dreams, so I guess I look like a corpse from the outside, but on the inside everything is quite vivid. But anyway, so Paloma Verde CBD, they're very good people, and they've got a good thing going there, and it's a very high quality product. So PalomaVerdeCBD.com, that's PALOMAVERDECBD.com, promo code KING, and they'll get you set up and taken care of, and that'll tell them that you came from us. And then while we're doing housekeeping stuff, welcome aboard anybody who hasn't listened before, and those of you who have, welcome back. Please remember to like this video and then share it and subscribe to our channel. And then if you're listening to this on iTunes after the fact, then please do us a favor and subscribe there, and then give us a 5-star rating and a review. We'll get everything up on iTunes here pretty soon, but it's fairly far down the to-do list at the moment. And so as the title implies, we're going to be doing a live reading of Chapter 3 of Minchus Moldbug's series called Patchwork, A Political System for the 21st Century. We've done the first 2 live readings of the first 2 chapters on our last couple episodes. So if you're watching this after the fact and you haven't listened to those 2 first, then go back and listen to them, because this 3rd chapter will make a lot more sense to you. The 3rd chapter might be my favorite of the series. It's very good. He's going to get into some really interesting stuff today, talking about, kind of describes the nature of the cathedral and the way that this new patchwork system he's suggesting, this joint stock CEO system, the way that it would work. We had an interesting little conversation going back and forth with one of our dear listeners, Model Mark, who we've talked to on the show here before. We've answered some of his questions in the chat, and he is not a fan of the system that we're describing, and he has all sorts of objections. So we were Popular Liberty and I were going back and forth with him yesterday or the day before. That was kind of interesting. So if you want to go look at our last episode and look at the comment section, there was a rousing conversation. And Popular Liberty says, if you're a libertarian who hasn't read anything, then GTFO. One thing that I want to make clear to people who are coming into this is we want to help other people to see the world the way that we do. However, if you come in and approach us guns blazing, telling us all the reasons why we're wrong, you'd better have something pretty creative that you're bringing to the table that is some way that you're poking a hole in what we're saying. If you're just repeating tired canards, like libertarianism 101 stuff, the sort of stuff that any person who's been a libertarian for more than a month or 2 could parrot, if they could repeat everything that you're saying, then don't expect to be taken seriously. And I suppose if you've never advanced beyond that point, then you might not know that there is a world beyond that point, so you might not recognize that in yourself. But just listen for a few episodes. Just come and just chill out and just listen to what we're talking about. And if everything seems just absolutely completely foreign to you, then you're probably best suited assuming that there's stuff that we're aware of that you aren't. Because I can just tell you that if you're listening to what we're saying and you're like, I've heard this stuff before, I know what these guys are saying, I've gone down this road, I've explored these things, and here's something I ran into that I just couldn't get past, that I didn't have an answer to. Please bring those to our attention, because we're always in the business of upgrading our ideological software, so to speak. We always want to be updating the operating system that we're running and making sure that we're taking into consideration all the possible data that we could. That being said, we are absolutely happy with you having any conversation you want in the comments. I'm never going to police the comments here. I'm not going to delete stuff unless it's just spam, unless it's just someone who's just like hawking something, or there's some bot or something like that. I go through and I delete those. But I'm not going to censor anything else that you want to say. But if you want to be taken seriously, and if you have a problem with being responded to in a dismissive fashion, then don't come saying stuff that's worthy of being dismissed. I'll just make it simple that way. So if you get a dismissive response, that's a good indication that you said something that's worthy of a dismissive response. And the reason why we get to dictate that is because this is our show and this is our subject matter. And you're perfectly welcome to go comment whatever you want anywhere else and try to get someone else to take you seriously. But if you don't give us something worth taking seriously, then we aren't going to take it seriously. All right. Did you want to add something?
talk to the hand is what you're going to get from Matthew.
Right. I'm just going to reply with a hand emoji.
You should really do that, please.
Oh, that's going to be fun. I'm going to laugh my ass off the first time that I do that. Mark, nice. Mark Egan in our comments, he says, "Sup Kings," and he said, "I wouldn't get good sleep if not for Paloma Verde." There you go. There's a pretty good shout out for Carlos and Vanessa. And Popular Liberty says, "InfoWars knockout plus fish oil plus Paloma Verde CBD." That is a phenomenal combination. Popular Liberty also says
Popular
that
Liberty doesn't have a pulse right now.
He is in another realm. He also said that he says, speaking of California, it's been decided by a secret cabal of liberty lovers that we need to stuff Matt in a trunk and kidnap him to Texas. Well, if you just wait a couple years, then I'll just do the job for you. You don't have to go to this whole kidnapping thing. I prefer not to spend any time inside trunks of cars, even if it does end with me in Texas. Also, because if you're going to stuff me in a trunk, you're going to have to deal with Amy, and I pity the fool who has to go through my wife, because she's ultimately going to be defending our son, and that's some mom bear status right there.
She's about to comment in here. She's about to just be like, "Nah, go for it. You're fine."
Right?
I guarantee you, she's typing.
I can't wait to see what she says now. Oh yeah, we signed a lease through September of 2023 here in Amy and Eastwood can ride in the front seat with dignity. Oh, there we go. She's going to scheme with them. She's going to work with them to make it happen. We signed a lease through the fall of 2023. But we are already in the process of scoping out our next move, and depending on how things go over the next year or two, we may find ourselves in the position for breaking our lease and getting out early. We'll see what happens. But if we had to move right now, Texas would probably be where we would go. And I can't really see much that's going to move Texas from the top of the list. There's a lot of really good people there. We've got some friends there. There's some good friends of the show are there in Central Texas. Popular Liberty is there. And Buck over at Counterflow, he's there. And we've got some other good friends who all live there. So we're actually going to be doing a road trip, I think, to, Carlos and Dennis are in San Antonio. There's really good people in that area. So the San Antonio, Austin, Houston, somewhere in that broad vicinity is probably where we're going to wind up. And we're going to be doing a trip out there probably sometime around Thanksgiving, sometime in the late fall, early winter this year, to kind of scope that area out. Because it's the only place I've ever been to in Texas was like the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And I drove there a couple times when I was in high school shortly thereafter. But I haven't really seen much else of Texas, so I want to go check it out. Mark Egan he says he's in San Antonio as well. So basically King Pilled is going to be the new headquarters of King Pill is going to be Central Texas. Amy says that at this rate we may have to get a truck just to tow Eastwood's wagon behind us. That's very true. Eastwood is the chonkiest of chonks that you have ever seen. Your future God Emperor of the world is off to a fantastic start. He is 99th percentile across the board. Height, weight, head circumference, everything. He is a gigantic child. We just weighed him the other day. He's 24 pounds, and he is just past 7 months old. So he's a freaking gigantic child. Anyway, so I think that's all of our housekeeping, all of our banter. One thing I wanted to touch on real quick was this article that we talked about in this morning's episode of Wealth, Power, and Influence, which is the other podcast that I do with Jason Stapleton. He brought this really, really interesting article up that we touched on for the show, and there was a few other things I wanted to point out about it beyond what we talked about on the show. So if you don't listen to Wealth, Power, and Influence fairly often, Steven typically is listening live when it happens, and we record there every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So especially on Mondays, typically I'll have extra thoughts that I didn't get out during the Wealth, Power, and Influence episode, and so I'll talk about them here. So if you go listen to that, we live stream at 10 a.m. Pacific time every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So if you wanted to listen to that, just look up Wealth, Power, and Influence of Jason Stapleton on Facebook or on YouTube, and you can see the episode there. So you can have the full context if I decide I want to bring something up for the afternoon show here. So the article that Jason mentioned is by this guy named Rob Henderson, who I've seen around. He started making some of the interview circuits lately. I think he was on Chris Williamson's show, Modern Wisdom, and I've seen him a few other places. He writes for Quillette, And he wrote an article called Thorstein Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class, a status update. And basically the idea that he's talking about is the fact that he is this concept of luxury beliefs, which are their ideas and opinions that confer status on the rich at very little cost while taking a toll on the lower class. So it's not just something that's a status-seeking belief or idea for the upper class. It's also something that the upper class is incentivized to participate in or to promote or to believe that has a negative effect on the lower class. And that's the reason that the upper class engages in it, because it's something that differentiates them. It's something that they can afford to do that the lower class cannot afford to do. And the fact that they can participate in this behavior or this belief or advocating for this policy or whatever else, the reason they can do it is because they're wealthy. Them being wealthy is what enables them to bear that cost. And what's really fascinating to me is I think this is one of the most important subjects you could possibly talk about, because this is how human societies form themselves. This is how they work. This is how they progress. This is how culture is developed. The elites have their own specific ideas and belief systems that they're incentivized to get involved in and to invest in because they personally benefit from them. And then the mimetic nature of human beings is such that the lower class, who wants to not be lower class, they want to be upper class, they mimic the upper class beliefs. They start aping what the upper class is doing, because if they do that enough times, if they mimic it, then the way that they think is that they'll eventually wind up in the upper class. And to a degree, that is true. We learn by mimicking, and LARPing can actually be a very real thing. If you LARP, you keep going through the motions. Eventually, you can start experiencing the benefits of those behaviors. So I'll put the link to the article in the show notes afterwards, or in the description on YouTube, so you guys can go read the article yourself. It's very, very interesting. But there was one part of it that I really wanted to point out, and so Rob Henderson is referring to this guy Thorstein Veblen and his theory of the leisure class, and one thing he refers to is the fact that animals participate in this sort of display, and one of the best examples is peacocks. So a peacock has its gigantic tail that's got all this plumage, and it's very beautiful and everything, but it's also very cumbersome and it's difficult to drag around. It makes it much harder for them to fly, to get away, to escape predators. So the fact that they would evolve something like that is a testament to the capability of that bird, the strength and the health and the vigor of that bird, that even with this gigantic encumbrance, they are still able to survive and thrive. And so then the ones who have the largest encumbrance, who are still thriving, they must be the most capable birds. And so those are the ones that it's an indicator of fitness. And so those are the birds that the female birds will be most attracted to, because that's the most adaptive strategy. And they know this on an instinctive level, because at the same time, the female birds who were attracted to the fittest male birds are the ones who reproduced. So their descendants are most likely to be attracted to the same type of bird as their ancestors. So through this process of selection, this process of natural selection, you get the peacocks that we see today. So the same thing happens with humans. And so this guy Veblen proposed that the wealthy flaunt these symbols not just because they're useful, but because they are so pricey or wasteful that only the wealthy can afford them, which is why they're high status indicators. A couple winters ago, it was common to see students at Yale and Harvard wearing Canada Goose jackets. Is it necessary to spend $900 to stay warm in New England? No. But kids weren't spending their parents' money just for the warmth. They were spending the equivalent of the typical American's weekly income, $865, for the logo. Likewise, are students spending $250,000 at prestigious universities for the education? Maybe, but they are also spending it for the logo. They're buying the logo because the logo is a status indicator. The wealthy families can bear that cost. They're willing to bear that cost because they know how to make it profitable. But then you'll have the lower classes will try to mimic them. So they're like, well, we can't send our kids to Harvard and Yale, so we need to have a discount university that we can send our kids to. And if we mimic the wealthy, then eventually we'll be wealthy as well. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. And so then when you advance a policy that's like, well, hey, we're gonna make college affordable to everybody so that they can all do the same thing as the higher class people do. Well, the only way that you can do that is by turning it into debt and incentivizing inflation. And that makes it so that the lower classes can do it. But once the lower classes start participating in that behavior, it becomes harmful to them because they can't bear that cost. They get bogged down in debt, and that debt ends up governing the rest of their lives, and it affects their descendants. It affects their ability to get married, their ability to procreate, and it can permanently alter that family line by having one generation that goes too far into debt for what's effectively a status symbol. So there's 2 paragraphs right here toward the end that I just wanted to read real quick because I thought that they really summarized everything the best. It says, the chief purpose of luxury beliefs is to indicate evidence of the believer's social class and education. Only academics educated at elite institutions could have conjured up a coherent and reasonable sounding argument for why parents should not be allowed to raise their kids, but should hold baby lotteries instead. Which was, and he links to an article that says if babies were randomly allotted to families, would racism end? That's not an idea that you're ever going to come up with as a working class plumber or something. You're only going to come up with that idea if you're already someone who lives in the higher classes. And only the people who live in the higher classes could practice something like that. The people in the lower classes would get dragged right into it as basically it would become a modern form of slavery, effectively. Because these kids, the people, the only way that they could participate and find a good life for their children would be to have their children sold off to a wealthier family. And you've gotten right back to a form of slavery. So he said, when these people, when affluent persons advocate for drug legalization or anti-vaccination policies, I don't understand his reference with that, or open borders or loose sexual norms, or uses the term white privilege, they're engaging in a status display. They're trying to tell you, I am a member of the upper class. Affluent people promote open borders or the decriminalization of drugs because it advances their social standing, not least because they know the adoption of those policies will cost them less than others. So there's 2 ways that I can get ahead of you. I can make your advancement more expensive, or I can make my advancement cheaper. Both of those will accomplish the same thing. So just because something makes me marginally worse off than before, if it makes you marginally even more worse off, then on net, I'll benefit. And this is the only way that we ever understand anything is just comparatively. We don't have absolute valuations for things. We understand everything as a comparison. So if a new policy is going to affect all of us negatively, but it's going to affect you more negatively than it affects me, then I'm incentivized to advocate for that policy because ultimately I'll be better off if I'm operating from obviously from a selfish point of view, a self-interested point of view. So it says, the logic is akin to conspicuous consumption. If you're a student who has a large subsidy from your parents, and I do not, you can afford to waste $900, and I can't. So wearing a Canada Goose jacket is a good way of advertising your superior wealth and status. Proposing policies that will cost you, as a member of the upper class, less than they would cost me serve the same function. Advocating for open borders and drug experimentation are good ways of advertising your membership of the elite because, thanks to your wealth and social connections, they will cost you less than me. Unfortunately, the luxury beliefs of the upper class often trickle down and are adopted by people lower down the food chain, which means many of these beliefs end up causing social harm. Take polyamory. I had a revealing conversation recently with a student at an elite university. He said that when he sets his Tinder radius to 5 miles, about half of the women, mostly other students, said they were polyamorous in their bios. Then, when he extended the radius to 15 miles to include the rest of the city and its outskirts, about half the women were single mothers. The costs created by the luxury beliefs of the former are borne by the latter. Polyamory is the latest expression of sexual freedom championed by the affluent. They are in a better position to manage the complications of novel relationship arrangements. And if these relationships don't work out, they can recover thanks to their financial capability and social capital. The less fortunate suffer by adopting the beliefs of the upper class. So I just thought that this was a really, really interesting article. Like I said, I'll put the link in the description. But it illustrates, I actually just saw at the top here that this article is pretty old, actually. He wrote this back in November of 2019. So it's interesting that it just popped up. But I think that part of the worldview that we're prescribing or that we're advocating here is one where wherein you recognize these dynamics, you recognize these social dynamics, and that this is the way that human beings arrange themselves. And that ultimately, if you want to get ahead, relatively speaking, there's one of two. You can either improve your own social capital, or you can surround yourself by people who have improved social capital. The two function the same way. It's two different ways of scaling your wealth. One is through your net worth, one is through your network. And ideally you would have both. And that's ultimately what we when you the modern capitalist individualism says basically that the thing that is the most economically beneficial is the best thing. But that's not always necessarily the case. There's lots of times where trying to get the cheapest price can compromise aspects of the cultural fabric that binds people together. And ultimately, you need that community. You need that community working together. Modern materialist consumerism will promote behaviors that will be harmful to the majority of people, because those who stand to gain the most from it are the people who are already part of the elite class. So just the same, if you have some specific sort of policy or habit or product or whatever that you want mass adoption for, you want people to buy in to something you have to offer, whether it's like a product you're trying to sell, or if it's a belief system that you want other people to share, it's going to have to appeal to the elites first. If it doesn't appeal to the elites, it will never experience mass adoption. Understanding how they think and how they operate and how they choose to spend their capital is crucial. It's essential. And if we ever want our ideas about politics or about economics or anything like that, if we ever want them to have any sort of a dent in the culture, then we have to figure out a way to convey them to the people who have the most wealth, power, and influence. And one of the best ways to do that is to you yourself have that wealth, power, and influence. That's why we get the title of the other show. So our show here is focused more on trying to analyze the culture and understand why the culture is the way it is, and to focus on how you can improve yourself, how you can improve your own person, both religiously, spiritually, and actually like physically and with your health and your daily habits, so that as we network together and as we all focus on improving our human capital, on net, the rising tide raises all boats, and on net we can form strong communities that are focused on doing things that actually work, not just ranting and raving about whatever happens to be most interesting to us, which is the typical conservative or libertarian bent. That's the way most conservatives and libertarians operate, and so it's no surprise that the belief systems are dying. They're falling apart, and they're being ground under the machine of the American empire. Okay, did you have any thoughts, Stephen?
No.
Perfect. Then we will get started here. Yeah, looking at the comments here, Popular Liberty says Burnham's theory of the elites, which he really derived in large part from Pareto, from Vilfredo Pareto, and from Gaetano Mosca, were the two of the most influential guys for him. Okay. Oh yeah, Carlos says Amazon wanting a $15 minimum wage, is this played out in actual policy? Bingo. That's a fantastic example of it. You get tremendous social capital from advocating for an increased minimum wage. And the major corporations will throw their weight and their credibility behind it because they benefit from it significantly. By raising the cost of the minimum wage, they're able to bear the increased cost of doing business, while other competitors are driven out of business because they can't handle it. They can't operate profitably while bearing that cost. So Amazon gets to benefit on both fronts. The people who are involved with the company get to get the social praise and the pats on the back for doing something that's so enlightened and progressive, but they also get the benefits of putting all their competition out of business and insulating their own market share. And this is that exact process repeats itself time and time and time again. And that it's basically the single reason why progressivism is so predominant now, because it provides so many opportunities like that. And all the suckers get sucked into supporting these policies because they don't understand the actual effects of them, but they want the social status that comes from seeming like you're a compassionate person, because most people are. Most people are genuinely compassionate, and it makes sense on a surface level. Hey, have the government mandate that these people have to be paid more. They'll have more money, they'll be better off, and then we all get to feel better. But the actual impact of it is they'll have more money for a short period of time, but then everything else is going to rise, and they're going to have less buying power with their money, and it will also have put all these other people out of business. And it's mandated unemployment, because there's some people that are never going to get a job for $15 an hour, no matter what the surrounding climate is. They just cannot function at a level high enough that they could get a job for $5 an hour, but it's become illegal to offer them a job for $5 an hour. So it hurts everybody except for the elites. So the elites advocate for it, and everyone else mimics them, and everyone else advocates for it because they want to mimic the elites. They want to be like the elites. This is progressivism in a nutshell. And the reason that it keeps advancing is because the incentive structures are set up such that it will keep progressing like this, because anyone who opposes it doesn't have a coherent response for it. Just pointing out, trying to get into this conversation, like what I just had, where I'm explaining the economics and everything, the vast majority of people have tuned out. They're done. They're not interested in that. It doesn't do anything for them. The only way that this progression forward into catastrophe, the only way that it's going to stop or change or shift direction at all, is if the elites become incentivized to participate in different behaviors, in new behaviors. So that's a hack. Now you're trying to engineer the system in a better way, and that's the way that we want people to think about it. We want people to think about these things from a hacker's perspective, from an engineering perspective, where you understand the nature of how the system works, and you're going to evaluate the whole thing comprehensively or holistically, and then be like, okay, well, if I push this little domino here, all this will have this cascading effect, and it'll have the outcome that I want. That's an engineering problem. It's not a moral question. You're not even talking about what policy is right. You're just having to talk about what works. You're having to come up with what works, and how can we get that passed? How can we get that implemented? How do we do that? So, now we advertise this as a live reading of Moldbug's work. So for those of you who've sat through the first half hour or so here, that's kind of what our normal shows are. We typically talk about that kind of thing. But let's get started on reading this. Someone in the comments said Popular Liberty series on archetropism on his YouTube channel is flames emoji. Yeah, I'm gonna put that link in the comments or in the show notes for today as well, because if you haven't seen Popular Liberty series on archetropism, you need to go watch it, and you need to understand what archetropism is and how it works. It's a neologism. It's a word that he coined specifically to describe this phenomenon that nobody has really attached a word to before. And there's this funny thing where you attach a word to a concept, and suddenly you have a way to talk about it, and you have a way to communicate it. Until the word is attached to it, it's just a bunch of vague ideas that are out floating there, not attached to each other. You attach them to a word, and that gives you something that's easily transferable. I can hand this word to you, and you can take the word from me, and you can go understand what that word means, and now you understand those concepts, and it makes communication a lot easier. So go check out, he just did a show last night with Adam Patrick on archetropism for 2 hours. That I'm definitely going to watch, because Adam Patrick is another really good dude, another good friend of the show. As soon as we start doing some interviews here, you guys will talk to a lot of these guys as well. Okay, so Patchwork, a political system for the 21st century. Chapter 3, What We Have and What's So Bad About It. Mencius Moldbug, November 27, 2008. This is chapter 3 of a 4-part series. I started this story with the assumption that everyone reading it would already be a hardened veteran of UR's brutal, disorienting assaults on everything that is good and decent and true. UR being Unqualified Reservations, which is the blog that he's writing on. This is obviously a counterfactual. And even for many hardened veterans, I fear, Patchwork has proved a rough ride. Here at UR, we have a very different approach from most who would like to change the world. Rather than actually trying to market our designs, presumably by making them sound familiar, appealing, and benevolent, we apply anti-spin. We strip off the fairing and present the cold, gritty gears of the naked machine. Our tone is at best neutral, at worst acid and nihilistic. Why? Well, for one, it's just more fun. Let's be clear about this. UR is a blog. UR is not a cult. It is not a subversive underground organization. It is certainly not a political party. It is something I write for fun and you read for fun. UR is part of the entertainment industry. But if there is a strategy behind the anti-spin, it is to maximize the quality of UR's audience by minimizing the quantity. Long posts help with this too. UR will not appeal to your heart. It will only appeal to your head, which must then often overcome the stomach. To put it simply, if you don't understand you are very unlikely to believe it. And this is better for both of us. So he's specifically trying to get a smaller audience. He's specifically trying to wean or winnow out the majority of people so that the audience that he has left is very high quality, because those are the people that he wants to relate with. He doesn't need mass acceptance or acknowledgement of these ideas, because he understands that that's not what drives a society. Society is not driven by what the majority of people like. Society is driven by what the minority of people like, and that minority being specifically the elites. On the other hand, there is no need to be mysterious. So, now that I've started to introduce this terrifying alternative, let me go back and explain why it's needed. Call it a prequel. Let's start with a point of agreement. Our goal, as people who live in a civilized modern society, is a system of government which is responsible. Good government is responsible government. The equivalence is a tautology. The question is, how shall we secure for ourselves the blessings of responsible government? Or, as Pope, being Alexander Pope, as Pope put it, for forms of government let fools contest. Whate'er is best administered is best. Unless you had quite an unusual education, you grew up believing that the problem is solved. Constitutional democracy is the best mechanism for producing responsible government. It certainly produces something. Let's call this something, whatever it is, moral responsibility. Here at UR, we see constitutional democracy as a sort of large, hydatid cyst. A hydatid cyst is like a cyst that's inside your brain, cuddled gently in the skull alongside one's actual neural tissue. The intrepid reader, with the instruments this blog provides, can extract the creature in the comfort and privacy of her own shower stall. As the neurosurgeon Dr. Ahmad notes, the space was filled with saline at the end of operation, which is certainly one option. But it leaves the patient a bit of a nihilist. The obvious drop-in replacement is royalism, of course. Royalism is really just reverting the changes, as we say, in my line of work, which is his line of work being how to become a hacker, is what he links to. So here at UR, we give it up for all royalists. Fill the cavity with gold. This will be young Jasmine's college fund as well as her skull ballast. For example, I have no hesitation in calling for the King of Thailand to throw off the reins of the transnationalists, obey the wishes of the people, and return the country to full independence and royal government. I have also previously noted that any corporate descendant of the old Union of England, Scotland, and Ireland, including but not limited to West Virginia, is entitled to restore the Stuarts through the princes of Liechtenstein. If you wonder what this would mean for you, personally, try the simple exercise of reading your quality local fish rag for a month, noting the top headline and asking, how would hereditary Prince Alois handle this? So fish wrap is slang for any printed journalistic medium, newspaper, magazine, etc. And Alois, the hereditary Prince of Liechtenstein, is the eldest son of Hans Adam II, the Prince of Liechtenstein, and the Countess Marie Kinsky von Wickditz und Tettau. He's been the regent of Liechtenstein, or in other words, basically he's the one who operates the government of Liechtenstein, which is a very, very fascinating governmental structure. It's a monarchy where the royal family basically provides for the majority of the expenses of the country, and then it also has like a parliament, I think, that functions essentially as a direct democracy. So anybody at any time within the country, I think the population's like 50,000 people or something, anyone at any time can go start a poll, and if they get, I think it's like 5,000 people or something to sign on to this poll, then that new law can be instantiated, or at least it gets brought before Parliament, and Parliament will debate it, and then you have to get like 10,000 signatures to have the thing be incorporated as part of the Constitution, something to that effect. And several years back, the prince of Liechtenstein actually went down to the street level and like went around getting people's signatures for a motion that he wanted to pass, which would have allowed individual Liechtensteinians, or whatever they're called, to secede from the government and become their own sovereign citizen. Like I think it was all the way down to the citizen level. It may have been the family level, but I think it was the citizen level. And so he was like trying to give people the opportunity to secede from his government altogether, because it just so happens that Hans Adam II, the father of this Prince of Liechtenstein, is an ANCAP, and he's friends with Hans Hermann Hoppe. And so he tried to get this policy passed that would have allowed people to secede down to the individual or family level, and it didn't pass. People didn't want that. They wanted to retain the ability for everyone to be invested into the government as the government structure is today. So it's extremely stable. I think it's the highest wealth per capita in the world. They're the wealthiest country per capita in the world, even more than Monaco, I'm pretty sure, and or like Dubai, and it's just an absolutely fascinating region. It's very small, and I know that they have extremely rigid immigration qualifications. Like I think if you want to immigrate there, it's like a process that you have to prove a lot of stuff. You have to like invest heavily in the country, and it takes 10 years or something along those lines. So there's a very interesting lesson to be learned from that. Anyways, so he said that if so basically he's saying that any corporate descendant of the old Union of Scotland and Ireland, which would include but not be limited to West Virginia, so any part of the United States or basically any Western nation, is entitled to restore the Stuarts through the Princes of Liechtenstein, because I think the Princes of Liechtenstein are descended from the original Stuarts. And he's saying if you want to know what that would mean for you, then just take your local magazine, look at the top headline, and say, how would this prince handle that situation? But royalism, even if you stick a neo on the front, is just too old-fashioned to appeal to some. So we also offer an extra decorative touch available for a mere $19.95, in which the customer can fill her cyst's void with our own synthetic organ of government. We call it neocameralism, and it is very fresh. Neocameralism informs the surrounding neural tissue that the best mechanism for producing responsibility in government is for governments to be administered as sovereign joint stock corporations, controlled absolutely by their shareholders, who hold the master encryption keys for the government's invincible robot armies. At some risk of oxymoronism, this could even be described as private government. It creates quite a different form of responsibility: financial responsibility. Of course, it's entirely possible that our so-called cyst could be a healthy, normal lobe of your brain, that our sinister, unapproved product could in fact insert a strange, translucent globe-like parasite which will control your destiny and lead you to an awful end. Ha ha! Yes, young Jedi, we are asking you to choose. Wield the red saber for the first time. Then visit our Sith library and learn the truth about this so-called council. You already know what they say about us. And the Sith library, he links to books.google.com. I wonder if that's a broken link that was supposed to go to something else. In other words, the financial responsibility created by joint stock sovereignty would be much more desirable in terms of quality of life for most residents than the moral responsibility which we presently enjoy thanks to constitutional democracy. Or so I assert. But this is a dangerous assertion because history teaches us very quickly that there are many worse things than constitutional democracy. I claim to be encouraging you to exchange the path of evil for the road of enlightenment, but I could be just doing the opposite. And even if I'm not, the surgery I recommend is traumatic by definition. The procedure has never been attempted, let alone tested, and the implant is something I whipped up in my garage out of spare helicopter parts. On the other hand, do you really want to go through life with a worm in your head? So let's get down to details and compare the moral responsibility of constitutional democracy with the financial responsibility of the sovereign joint stock company. I think we can all agree that these are both legitimate forms of responsibility and they are very different. After 2008, no one can possibly accuse constitutional democracy of being a financial responsible form of government. Likewise, the neocameralist state is amoral by definition. And remember, this was written in 2008. So he's making this case right at the height of the 2008 financial crisis. I don't think there is much contest on the financial side of the ledger. Let's consider morality. The constitutional democratic state is an apparently immortal, monotonically expanding, and non-trivially morbid mass of personnel which proclaims itself the instrument of a single purpose: to inflict good upon the world. For traditional countries, this affliction was at least limited to specified borders. But in the case of USG, or U.S. government, since 1945 it knows no bound. Washington operates on the principle of universal benevolence. Its ultimate aim is to benefit all people, anywhere, and for all time. Doubtless, if aliens were found on Jupiter, concern for their welfare would soon be felt on the Potomac. A joint stock sovereign is a clean, lean, and mean revenue extracting machine. Its goal? Loot. Any well-run patchwork realm is congenitally dedicated to the good old Marxist ideal of exploitation. It has no intrinsic sympathy for the aged, the crippled, the deformed, and the useless. Into the biodiesel vats with them. Gold coins literally wrung from the hides of the unfortunate will cascade into the piggy banks of our obese, cigar-chomping shareholders. Obviously, whatever you think of democracy, this is unacceptable. To mollify the conscience of the increasingly appalled reader, let me explain the logic of philanthropy in the financially responsible city-state. We will return to the broader contest of morals in a moment. Government is like a nuclear reactor or a stem cell. Perfect when it works properly, and lethal when it doesn't. Like both, any design for a sovereign institution must depend on multiple independent safety mechanisms. If all safeguards fail, something unacceptable will happen, by definition. If all but one fail, the result may not be desirable, but it will not be unacceptable. So let's look at the safety mechanisms that prevent the healthy patchwork city-state from turning into its evil twin with the biodiesel vats. By my count, there are 3. The outermost mechanism is mere PR. Don't be evil is the automatic slogan of every private government. That was the slogan of Google. At the sovereign level, Google's motto would not even be a winner, because to even mention evil is suspicious, like a sign outside a restaurant promising an absence of rats. At least, in normal conditions of inter-patch peace and harmony, every patchwork realm should positively exude rectitude and benevolence. This will, of course, infect its corporate culture. Perhaps it is possible to imagine Disneyland committing genocide, but it would have to be a very different Disneyland than the one we have right now. They would certainly have to replace at least half the employees. At the financial level, the realm must remember, however, that its concern is not with actual benevolence, but simply with the appearance of benevolence. Fortunately, image is cheap. Not screwing up image is cheaper. It costs you nothing, as long as you don't screw up. And best of all, evil, while it really screws up image, just isn't that profitable. Once you factor in even a tiny image effect, it is surprisingly difficult to devise any scenario that generates ROI out of pure balls-to-the-wall straight-out evil. For example, we'll be lucky if we can squeeze $25 worth of industrial fats out of Granny's cadaver. They say no publicity is bad publicity, but they lie. So why not just run our buses on dinosaurs the good old-fashioned way and keep Granny in her pen with the automatic monkey chow dispenser? Perhaps you see PR as a weak line of defense, and it would be hard to disagree. Fortunately, it's only one of 3. But the factor is real. A sovereign is a sovereign, and no government can be entirely without paternal graces. No one in a sane society will be rendered into diesel, or even be allowed to starve to death for lack of productive earning power. Perhaps there are enough Randians on the planet for one city-state, but probably not 2. Otherwise, it just won't happen, and keeping it from happening is just one of the realm's many business expenses. Granny's monkey chow skims off the merest tablespoon of the rich butter which the realm churns metaphorically, rather than literally, from its residents' hard-working flesh. So in other words, the patch, the realm, their responsibility for taking care of Granny is so inexpensive compared to the cost of not taking care of Granny. If they don't take care of Granny and they develop a reputation as a place that won't take care of Granny and that will mistreat Granny, then nobody will want to live there. And their reputation taking a hit will make their real estate value take a hit, which is the only value that matters to them. Their job is just to maximize the value of their real estate. That's all they're interested in because that's how they get paid. So there's an incentive there. There's a natural product incentive there, similar to the reason why a store doesn't want to have something that they don't want to have dangerous. They don't want to have like water spilled across the pathway through their store, through the aisle. If they have water spilled across the aisle, some old lady's going to slip and fall and break a hip, and they're going to be stuck with the bill. And even if they don't want to pay the bill, even if they have a way of avoiding paying the bill, everyone then is going to know, well, if you go there, your granny might slip and fall and break her hip, and then these people are assholes and they won't take care of her. So that the cost of avoiding that situation is much less than the cost of actually turning Granny into, biodiesel. Obviously, the joke that he's making about it. But so PR itself, especially in the internet era, in the social media era, in the social justice era, it's so easy to try to avoid the appearance of evil when your profit incentive is aligned perfectly. And that's much easier to accomplish than the alternative. So if you're concerned about evil, there's going to be a very little incentive for companies to actually be evil in a situation like this. However, we arrive at the next safety barrier: mere private philanthropy. It is interesting to note the way in which one sniffs at mere private philanthropy. This is the thinking of the 20th century, the century of welfare. This was a word with only positive connotations until the 20th century got its hands on it. Another word for private philanthropy, with different negative connotations, is charity. Charity was, of course, one of the principal obligations of the medieval ecclesiastical establishment, the other two being education and adult instruction. In consonance with the general 20th century pattern in which the state has captured the role of church, thus affecting the merger of the two by different means, most of us today perceive charity as a sovereign function. There's a really fascinating observation that he makes in here. The fact that the modern state is occupying the role that the church used to occupy. The church was responsible for charity. The church was responsible for education. The church was responsible for adult instruction. That was what that institution existed for. Now, people are like, oh, well, we're so much more we're so much more enlightened now because we've abandoned religion. Now we have an institution that's much less incentivized to be responsible and competent and not corrupt than the church was. The state has even more distance between them and their subjects, and even more excuse and incentive and ability to be corrupt than the church ever did, and it's occupying the exact same role. So it's effectively a new church. People just don't see it as a church, but it still operates as a church. And all the more so with each passing day. I need a drink of water. Okay. Okay, so it's in consonance with the general 20th century pattern in which the state has captured the role of church, thus affecting the merger of the two by different means. Most of us today perceive charity as a sovereign function. So, you can see this too, in that people will say they treat the fact that there's people who are getting private charity as like a failure of the state. That, oh, these people had to go get help from someone privately because the state didn't take care of them. That thinking would have been unfathomable to people even just a century or two ago. Today it seems normal, and there's this incentive to try to eliminate private charity altogether. And thus we trivialize any charitable establishment which is fully outside the state, as only the most hardline of unreconstructed ecclesiasts are today. Nonprofits in the U.S. today tend to fund themselves via a mix of donations with government grants, contracts, etc. However, we can measure the demand for charity, meaning, of course, the demand for the production of philanthropy, not for its services, by the benchmark of government itself. Americans today, by and large, consider their taxes neither too high nor too low, and certainly the left half of the electorate is inclined to feel that Washington should raise even more revenue to do even more. Since Americans also see their government as a general purpose agency for the doing of good, a sovereign charity, we can measure their demand for philanthropy by noting the absence of significant political resistance to their present tax rate. Moreover, if you are critical of this methodology, note that any assertion that present tax rates are obtained by chicanery, other than genuine consent, hardly constitutes a defense of modern democracy. Basically, people don't like paying their taxes, but there's no big resistance to it. So that means that you could take that same amount of money and you could apply it toward an actual charity, and there likely wouldn't be that big of a resistance to it because people are already wired to have X amount of their income go towards something like this. The traditional contribution for charity was, of course, the tithe, or 10% of income. It was over a century into Washington's existence before it figured out how to exact anything like a tithe. But eventually, as it morphed into the church of everything, it mitigated this deficiency. Unfortunately, there is no word which is as cool as tithe, but means 40%. In any case, even in the brutal, inefficient, and decidedly untechnological Middle Ages, 10% has been considered an ample level of productivity for a civilized society to donate to the needs of the fortunate. Furthermore, private charity has enormous advantages over welfare. The voluntary nature of the contact between provider and recipient frees the former to assume authority, informal or formal, over the latter. If you don't want to be ordered around, you're free to starve, or at least go to prison. In prison, you will certainly be ordered around. If you are not competent to provide for your own existence, you become by definition a dependent of whomever is willing to provide for you. And with dependency comes authority. the patria potestas, which was the subject he touched on last time. Patria potestas being the power of the head of a Roman family over his wife, children, descendants, slaves, and freedmen, including originally the right to punish by death, and always embracing complete control over the limited personal and private rights and duties of all members of the family. So there was the idea of a free individual being free to just do whatever they want. That kind of didn't really exist back then. Everything operated on the level of family, and your family advocated for you and looked out for you, starting at the top with your father. And the father, because he was responsible for taking care of all of you and providing for all of you, he also had the authority over you, because responsibility and authority must go hand in hand. If you take responsibility away from someone, but you give them authority, that's a recipe for corruption. That's the definition of corruption, is authority without responsibility. And that's what the modern democratic state is incentivized to provide. Since you are not responsible for yourself, being someone who doesn't want to be ordered around and doesn't want to accept charity, since you are not responsible for yourself, whatever charitable agency or other party has taken charge of you is now your legal guardian, putting you essentially in the position of a child. Moreover, your guardian is also responsible for any offenses you may commit. There are no irresponsible or feral humans in a patchwork realm, unless this is some perverse lifestyle feature it sees fit to provide. As we can see, the second safety barrier is considerably stronger than the third. Moreover, we are about to arrive at the first safety barrier, which cements the second and can be regarded as a complete refutation of social democracy. Consider the thinking of the social democrat. To him, as previously mentioned, government is a sovereign and universal charity. Its purpose is to use its resources to do good works. These resources are derived, obviously, from the same source as with all governments: taxation. The wisdom of the people, through the magic of democracy, guides said sovereign and universal charity to use its resources efficiently for good works, not inefficiently for evil works. Or, worst, efficiently for evil works. This is our vaunted moral responsibility. Any neo-cameralist who wanders by can observe that this system is easy to improve in two ways. One, the people are not wise, and the magic of democracy does not exist. Therefore, we should not rely on the wisdom of the people for anything, and we should eliminate the superfluous electoral component of the design. Specifically, we should definitely not rely on the wisdom of the people to either A, formulate public policy, or B, allocate budgets. Fortunately, this point is hardly debatable. If you listen to NPR, you already believe that budget and policy should be held virginal from the awful contamination of politics. And if you don't listen to NPR, your opinion is of negligible importance in the budget and policy process. Once this change is applied, allocations for good works as a percentage of disposable spending are constant. So, for example, the environment gets 10% of USG's disposable spending, i.e., spending which is not essential to the production of future revenue. AIDS gets 5%, education of children with Down syndrome gets 3%, the spina echidna gets 1%, or whatever. Note that A, these figures are relatively constant anyway, due to the natural push and pull of the budgeting process. My mother did budget and policy at DOE, so I know a thing or two about zero-based budgeting, that unicorn of the Potomac. And zero-based budgeting is the method of budgeting in which all expenses must be justified and approved for each new period. Developed by Peter Purr in the 1970s, zero-based budgeting starts from a zero base at the beginning of every budget period, analyzing needs and costs of every function within an organization and allocating funds accordingly, regardless of how much money has previously been budgeted to any given line item. And he calls it the unicorn of the Potomac. Okay, so note that these figures are relatively constant anyway due to the natural push and pull of the budgeting process, and B, keeping them actually constant eliminates a very, very large number of meetings. If change must be provided for, a leftover slice of the budget can be allocated to a miscellaneous fund. And he links to the campaign poster for Obama that said change. So basically what he's saying is that the stuff that has to go, all the charitable, all the good work stuff that a modern constitutional democracy does, that a patchwork realm could do those things, and it would just have a section of the budget set aside for managing all that stuff. And it would be basically what the budget is today. It could stay relatively constant, and it doesn't change that much, like quarter over quarter, year over year. It stays relatively keeping them relatively constant means you don't have to have all these bureaucrats who are responsible for tweaking this thing and that thing and whatever. Because one of the natures of the modern state bureaucracy is that everyone wants to give their buddy a position. Everyone wants to wants to insulate their own position and create new positions for all the other people who depend upon them. So you get this big, gigantic, sprawling bureaucracy, which isn't necessary. The vast majority of those people could just get cut right off, no longer need to be employed because the budget isn't changing. So we don't need all these budget analysts. The budget is what the budget is. And if it needs to change, if someone turns out, the environment needs an extra 1% or whatever, then we have a miscellaneous fund that we can draw from on an as-needed basis. This is what he's describing. He says, but wait, there is another name for disposable spending. The name is profit. And these shares of the budget also seem familiar. In fact, we have improved our constitutional democracy so completely that we have turned it into a neo-cameralist joint stock company. And we've not even harmed the funding or organization of charity even slightly. To the contrary, we have freed it from bushels of red tape. The trick is that we've converted an argument about what the government should do into an argument about who should hold the government's shares. But this decision is way above my pay grade because the initial share allocation must be performed by whoever actually creates the government. While this is completely independent of the design, I'm pretty confident that any conversion of a constitutional democracy into a joint stock corporation will include a high level of continuity from charitable budget allocations in the democracy to share allocations in the corporation. So if you have some sort of charity that currently gets $5 billion a year from the U.S. government, if it's converted into a joint stock corporation, then that joint stock corporation, that charitable organization will just hold whatever percentage of that joint stock corporation they had of the budget of the former U.S. government. So if the U.S. government is, so say they get $1 billion and the budget of the U.S. government was $20 billion, they would get 1/20th of the shares of that government. That's how it would break down. It'd just be a direct translation over there. And now they have those shares, so they're entitled to that level of return from the government to continue doing their charitable work. He says, consider an indubitably worthy recipient of philanthropic funding, NIH. NIH's budget is $30 billion or so. If we separate NIH completely from the state and convert its budget, for which it must fight every year, into state shares producing dividends or other payments of $30 billion every year, what has changed? NIH is happier because it now has $30 billion with no strings attached. Certainly the guidance of Congress or whatever does not assist NIH in doing its job. Quite the contrary. The less political and bureaucratic interference it receives, the better. We have just reduced this to zero, so NIH is happy. Moreover, it is even happier because this payment stream is presumably produced by shares, bonds, or other negotiable instruments which NIH can sell and diversify, thus creating a well-structured endowment for the long-term funding of biomedical research. As for the payers of the $30 billion, they pay whatever they pay. So this transformation, which can be applied to any charity or entitlement, at least any which does not depend on the sovereign authority of the state in order to do its good works, is a Pareto optimization. It eliminates the phenomenon of official charity, the hallmark of social democracy, QED. Again, it is easy to apply this fix to entitlements, such as Social Security or Medicare. For Social Security, it is Granny rather than NIH, which is owed a payment stream. For Medicare, the state can go from providing medical care to purchasing an insurance policy, and from purchasing an insurance policy to providing the payment stream needed to purchase a policy. Both these changes are Pareto optimizations, and they end up back at financial responsibility. Therefore, if you are setting up something like a patchwork realm, and you are worried that its residents will not donate sufficient alms to fund good works, assign some percentage of the realm's shares, or bonds or other securities, to those same good works. Problem solved. So why do we have social democracy? If only it would tell us. So, having refuted the hypothesis that democracy is what it says it is, let's have a look at what it actually is. Being a completely uneducated person, I do not know Latin or Greek, but I do have a favorite Latin word, imperium. There you go, Stephen. You were asking me about imperium earlier, which you still need to tell me about. But
I think that might be a book that we don't mention on this channel.
Oh, what book?
I found out.
What book? I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, but there's the people who tend to be into it. I don't know.
Oh, it's one of those books.
It is one of those books, my friend.
All right, well, I'll find out more about it later. For now, let's talk about the other kind of imperium. As in imperialist, of course, and other such Maoist terms of abuse. As I am already on record as a reactionary, I will cheerfully confess to being an imperialist as well. Imperium is a cognate of the English word empire, but the two are not synonyms. Empire in English has shifted to imply the international relationship known as suzerainty, i.e., the relationship between Washington and its puppet states, which is pretty cool, but which is at best a special case of imperium, which is better translated as command or authority. Similarly, the Roman title of imperator, which became our emperor, is best translated as commander and originally just meant general. Suzerainty, which is a word that if you haven't read Moldbug before, you probably haven't run into. It's a relationship in which one state or other polity controls the foreign policy and relations of a tributary state, while allowing the tributary state to have internal autonomy. So it's sort of like a modification of colonialism. So the state is free to run itself internally as it sees fit, but it's I don't know what the term, it's suzerain. Yeah, it's suzerain. The dominant state, the suzerain, controls the foreign policy of that country. They'll leave them free to do whatever they want internally, but they're going to control their relationship to other states, which over a period of time naturally leads to them controlling what happens within the country as well, just because that's a natural progression. So the Roman title of imperator, which became our emperor, is best translated as commander and originally just meant general. To hold imperium is to command, to hold sovereignty. Sovereignty, as we saw in chapter 2, is not sovereignty unless it is above the law. In any organization, we can identify the summum imperium, or the power of final decision. At least at a civilian level, this is generally held either by an individual or a small committee. For example, in the United States, this committee is called the Supreme Court. In the Soviet Union, it was called the Politburo. Of course, these two institutions had very little else in common, but they both held the summum imperium. If you doubt this analysis, note that only the justices' own consciences, which have oft proved fickle, force them to obey any code of conduct whatsoever. They could order Barack Obama to stand on his head and snap a Polaroid of his own rectum in order to be inaugurated. He would have to comply, and I'm quite confident that he's capable of doing so. Despite all protests to the contrary, constitutional democracy has neither squared the circle nor solved the old Roman problem of ipsos custodes. Ipsos custodes meaning, which is a reference to who watches the watchers. Whatever the names and rituals, real power in the state can always be tracked. Let's look in more detail at the power structure of constitutional democracy using our old friend USG as the example. Its clones around the world differ little. Imperium always comes in layers of delegation, in which one power relinquishes decisions to another. At the top level, level 0, as it were, is always the military. The US military is, of course, a large and diverse entity, but imagine it could find some way to agree unanimously that sovereignty, the summum imperium, would revert to some specific office in the Pentagon. SOCOM is a good candidate. What would people do? What could they do? They would say, okay, we welcome our new Green Beret overlords. Sure, frankly, we were a little electioned out anyway, and Professor Bernanke no longer enjoys our complete confidence. So yeah, whatever. Could we resume normal programming now? I was watching VH1 here. Ergo, the military in all countries and at all times enjoys the summum imperium. In a state in which normal civil-military relations pertain, the military is completely passive and delegates its authority completely. In a few less devolved states, such as modern Turkey, it still exercises genuine reserve power and may have some influence on civil decisions. Reserve power is, in a parliamentary or semi-presidential system of government, a reserve power is a power that may be exercised by the head of state without the approval of another branch of the government. Unlike in a presidential system of government, the head of state is generally constrained by the cabinet or the legislature in a parliamentary system, and most reserve powers are usable only in certain exceptional circumstances. So, close this here. So in Turkey, the military actually at any point can step in and take control of the government it's like a part that's baked into the constitution. And I know that something happened with I just forgot the name of Turkey's Grand Poobah. I can't remember the guy's name. Someone's going to put it in the chat. anyway, he did something recently related to that, where I think he suspended it or invoked it or did something with it. I can't remember exactly. And so Turkey's military at any point can step in and invoke its reserve power, and it can take over an election or do whatever else as a means of protecting the sovereignty of the government. One interesting point that Moldbug makes, I can't remember where, I don't think he makes it in this piece, somewhere else he did, is he said that the reason that the federal government controls the United States is because the federal government has a military occupation of the United States. It's not because the Constitution says so. It's not because of any other reason other than they control the military. And as long as you control the military, you control what happens with the rest of the government. So he says, sadly, the fabled deep state may be on the decline since the Ergenekon purge. There's a couple times where it's kind of interesting. He references the deep state and he's kind of dismissive of it. And that's another question I'd be very interested to ask him now. What does he think of the so-called deep state? What would he call it? Now that it's very obvious that there are lots of intelligence agencies and bureaucratic organizations within the federal government that aren't responsive at all to the rest of the government. They kind of do their own thing and run their own system, and they do a lot of it behind the scenes, and they coordinate behind the scenes with journalistic organizations and with other NGOs and everything. Would he consider that a deep state, or would he put a different name to it? So that's a good conversation to have with him at whatever point we have him on here. Okay, says, I'm sorry to report to critics of the American right, such as Naomi Wolf, that the United States does not, in fact, have a deep state. However, if the American right wanted to actually get off its butt and do something, it could find many worse manuals than her latest, in which he links to The End of America, Letter of Warning to a Young Patriot. So he's giving the his stamp of approval to Naomi Wolf, at least that book. Of course, it will execute no such coup, at least no time soon. Ever since Defoe wrote The Shortest Way, the conspiracy theories of leftists have been the best guide to what the right should do, but won't. So in other words, the leftists always have this vision of this cabal of evil, potential totalitarian. The fascists are right around the corner, and all these evil, dangerous right wingers are coming to get us. And it's never actually true, but it would be a very good thing if it was.
Billy Graham and Steve Bannon are conspiring to whatever. Do whatever Billy Graham and Steve Bannon would be conspiring to do. It is kind of amazing. Yeah, like watching Secession, that show. Have you seen that at all?
Mm-mm.
No. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting.
Good.
It does have this kind of. I mean, it's on HBO, but like just the idea that there's like this sort of this big media company with a huge right-wing bent that kind of is just sort of secretly running everything behind the scenes and kind of dictating the course of the country. It's a good show, but it's just so kind of fucking delusional. Also, you can just it's definitely the product of Hollywood. If only.
Is it modern, or when is it set?
No, it's modern. It's modern.
Interesting. Okay, I've heard lots of friends of mine who talk about it, and I got the idea that it was an older show, but that's very interesting. I'm gonna check it out.
No, it's good, but it's just it just kind of like plays into that. Well, it makes you ask. It's just like, what, you guys actually see the world around you? You don't know you're winning. That's amazing.
It was Erdogan. That's what I was trying to think of. I knew that someone was going to say it, and that I was gonna remember it and kick myself as soon as I heard it. But yeah, Erdogan. He had a false flag coup a couple years ago. There was this big thing about, there's a coup and Erdogan is in hiding and all of this, and the whole thing was a total false flag that he orchestrated so that he could take more power. Which is there you go. There's your archetropism, where he creates chaos to give himself the opportunity to take more power for himself. I actually. This is probably dangerous to say on YouTube, so I won't say it too clearly. But there are probably worse people than him in the direction that he wants to take his country. He's very off in many ways, but he's not off in a lot of ways as well. I think that he one thing that a lot of people may not realize is that Erdogan is a pretty like a religious zealot, or at least he plays one. He pretends to be one, at the very least. He's very religiously radical and in a conservative sense. from his perspective. So he's a very interesting. He's a very interesting character. I've learned a little bit about him. If you want a really interesting look at him, actually, from people who aren't really sympathetic to him, go look at one of the early episodes of The Portal by the Eric Weinstein's podcast, where he brings on Timur Kuran, the guy the economist who coined the term preference falsification. He's Turkish, and they have a conversation about Erdogan, and it was very interesting. This was 2 or 3 years ago now, but that's a pretty interesting conversation. You want to know more about him. Yeah, Popular Liberty said the dude is super savvy. He's both kinds of radicals. Yeah, he's a very, very interesting character, and their Turkish government is very interesting too. It's this weird hybrid of radical conservative Islamic, but then like Western secular. When I was in Turkey in 2007, it was interesting walking around because you would see women wearing like the full like headdress, like face completely covered, with like a mini skirt and a bikini top. It was the weirdest combination of things. So they were like super modest with their head, but then basically wearing their underwear otherwise. So it's a very weird combination of very, very secular and westernized and very radically religious, radically conservatively religious. It's a wonderful area. It was really cool going and seeing all of the cities from Revelation. Thessalonica and Laodicea and all this, and Smyrna and all these different. We did a little loop around and went and saw all the what do you call it, the ruins of their old churches and cities and stuff. And then we went out into the eastern part of the central part of the state of the country. Cappadocia is the area. It's a very, very fascinating, kind of like a desert area, but it's very beautiful and the people are fascinating. I really wish we could go back there and check it out again, but that's fairly ill-advised in the current climate. Okay. Ever since Defoe wrote The Shortest Way, the conspiracy theories of leftists have been the best guide to what the right should do but won't. The next layer of imperium in a democratic state, layer 1, is, of course, the electorate, i.e. the people who vote. My belief is that the electorate holds a high degree of imperium My belief that the electorate holds a high degree of imperium is not at all inconsistent with my belief that the influence of elections on public policy is generally small. The same, after all, can be said of the military, whose vote is final, but at present unexercised. So in other words, the people have a lot of power if they want to exercise it. They just don't. They allow themselves to be bound to the election system, and they allow themselves to be instructed on how to vote. But if they decided that they wanted to invoke the people wanted to invoke their reserve powers, they could get a lot accomplished very quickly. And that's that's why the system is so sensitive to the dangers of populism, because there's kind of an implicit understanding that if the people really did rise up, they actually could do something and the elections could change something. But the people just never rise up. They never actually do it. So just because they could, just same with the military could step in and invoke its powers at any point, but it just doesn't. Same with the people. The electorate and the military are layers 1 and 0 because the military can resist anyone in the contest for sovereignty, and the electorate can resist everyone but the military. For example, control of 51 senators and the presidency is sufficient to defeat all other institutions in USG because it is sufficient to pack the Supreme Court. Obviously, the electorate can achieve this. It may not even need the senators. Consider the case of a presidential candidate whose platform is plain about her plans. If elected, she will suspend all other institutions and rule as a dictator. Suppose Sarah Palin, for example, ran on this platform in 2012. Suppose she won. Does anyone doubt that Washington would obey her every personal whim exactly as it obeyed, say, FDR's? I suppose it would depend on whether Governor Palin has the natural knack of imperium, and we can't know this unless we actually see her in action. But I actually suspect she might. That would be an interesting one to bring up to him, too. Like, does he still feel the same way about that this phrase where he says, suppose Sarah Palin won on that platform, does anyone doubt that Washington would obey her every personal whim exactly as it obeyed, say, FDR's? Because obviously we got a lesson in something similar to that with Trump. And there was a degree to which they obeyed, but then to a very large degree they didn't. So I wonder if his opinion on that would change.
I wonder if his opinion would be that Sarah Palin is more Trump than Trump was Trump.
That's a very interesting thought.
I wonder if he might, but that's just me wondering.
Put that on the list. Put that on the list for us to ask him. When we do that, we can play a picture of her dancing and rapping in The Masked Singer. She was dressed up as something. I don't remember what. Sarah Palin, Masked Singer.
Yeah,
She
I think Trump is just as good at the facade, but then I wonder if deep down she really has it in her, where Trump maybe doesn't quite have it.
and she's got the the executive experience, and she's obviously not. I think she's very similar to Trump in the sense that people see both of them as buffoons, as like bumbling buffoons, but they're actually much sharper and more competent than people will give them credit for. She was on The Masked Singer. She was the bear. It was like this looks like cotton candy colored goofy looking bear that she was dressed up as, and she danced and rapped Baby Got Back, and it was absolutely hysterical. She's pretty funny. But yeah, anyways, that would be a very interesting conversation to have with him. Okay, so we move to the next stage, level 2, ultimate civil authority. The summum imperium here rests, as mentioned, in the Supreme Court, and more generally, the judicial system. Judges try to avoid actually formulating public policy, however, typically delegating this task to executive agencies. Domestic, and rarely foreign policy, is sometimes altered in broad strokes by Congress. There are also various differences depending on whether the president is a Democrat or Republican, but we're down to minutia at this point. When we look at the remarkable stability of Washington, even in pursuing paths which to the outside eye are plainly, even comically counterproductive, we have to focus our attention first on level 1, the electorate. The opinion of the electorate is exactly what it is supposed to be, the hinge of power in the United States today. Level 0 is passive. Level 2 cannot resist level 1. Therefore, to understand the forces directing the actions of Washington today, we have to understand one thing: the relationship between levels 1 and 2, the electorate and the, mostly, permanent government. Who are these voters anyway? There are innumerable ways to classify the American voter, at least half of which UR has already indulged in. But I hate to repeat myself, so let's try to come up with something new. One way to ask how American voters will vote is to consider what they are trying to accomplish when they go to the ballot box. Obviously, they are making an altruistic attempt to affect the direction of government policy. The attempt is altruistic because no voter seriously expects his or her vote to affect his or her life. Obviously, few of them have anything near an understanding of what Washington actually is. Most have only a dim grasp of even the official story. And for official story, he underlines, he links to americancivicliteracy.org. Most have only a dim grasp of even the official story, but still, they are thinking something when they fill in the box for the R or the D. What is it? There are basically 3 ways in which American voters, or voters anywhere in the world for that matter, conceptualize their participation in democracy. From the bottom up, we can label these modes tribal, populist, and institutionalist. Tribal voters vote on the basis of ethnic and familial identity. In one very legitimate sense, they are the most rational voters around. A tribal voter is acting collectively to benefit his or her tribe. This group can be hereditary, adoptive, occupational, etc., as long as it feels some sort of collective cohesion or asabaya. Asabaya is a very interesting term. It's an Arabic term for group feeling or social cohesion. It's a concept of social solidarity with an emphasis on unity, group consciousness, and a sense of shared purpose and social cohesion, traditionally used in the context of tribalism and clanism. Asabaya is neither necessarily nomadic nor based on blood relations. Rather, it resembles a philosophy of classical republicanism. In the modern period, it's generally analogous to solidarity. However, it is often negatively associated because it can sometimes suggest nationalism or partisanship, i.e. loyalty to one's group regardless of circumstances. Perish the thought that someone be loyal to their own group regardless of the circumstances. But I think that especially right-wing Americans would do very, very well to develop or re-evolve some form of asabaya or collective cohesion. In a civilized, stable democracy, only a minority of voters can be tribal. If you want to see a democracy with a tribal majority, I give you South Africa. As a minority, tribal voting blocks generally serve as vote banks for more dominant players. The tribal bloc or blocks become clients of whichever party is strong enough to buy their votes. This can be done as straight out lawless graft or by steering various benefits, payments, loans, jobs, etc. to members and or leaders of the tribe. This is what Democrats are the best at. They've accumulated all these voting blocks because their politicians and their bureaucrats go out of their way to steer special benefits to those voting blocks. You got the black vote, you got the Hispanic vote, you got the Asian vote, you have the unions, you have the teachers unions. You got all these different voting blocks, and they send all of the, you have LGBT is another one, and now they're trying to create all these different Asian voting blocks because they've realized that Asians don't have any time whatsoever for this whole LGBT, BLM, Antifa, all these things. Asians traditionally have no time whatsoever for that sort of thing, especially the ones who have come to the United States. Because typically the ones who have come to the United States are trying to avoid that whole sort of thing that was happening back in their country. They want to come here because they want to put their nose to the grindstone and they want to make a bunch of money to take care of themselves. So they're very insular. And traditionally, they've voted Democrat just because it happened to suit their interests in the past. But they're starting to move away from the Democrats as the Democrats are getting crazier. That's why you're getting this whole big emphasis on the AAPI, the Asian American and Pacific Islanders, or most recently I saw it was AANHPI. It was Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, or something to that effect. So they keep trying to create, they're getting more and more ham-handed with it, trying to create these voting blocks and get those people to try to vote for them by representing their interests. But because it's getting so much more ham-handed, they're starting to lose those blocks. So like Hispanic Americans voted way more for Trump, and especially down around the border for Trump than they've voted for a Republican in a very long time. And that's because the really radical progressive nature of the Democrat Party today, especially their open borders positions, is very intolerable to a lot of these people. If you want to see people who are very intolerant to the idea of immigrants or of like lax immigration policies, talk to most like American Hispanics who are descended from immigrants or people who have immigrated here. They typically are the strongest advocates for strict immigration policies because they're like, we moved here to get away from those people. Don't bring them up here. Okay, so this is why Florida, with all the Cubans in Florida, they tend to be to vote very Republican and be very conservative because they're like leave the commies in Cuba. Okay.
Yeah, that would be that's for the supporting listeners group. I've got some videos.
There's Imperium. Is that where Imperium?
There's some. Well, yeah, we could do Cuban Imperium. I guess we'll say. Yeah, because there's some material out there. Oh boy.
Oh boy. Okay. Okay, so our second group, so our first group of voters was he's describing three different modes of American voters, or really any voters anywhere, the way that they participate in democracy. There was tribal, there was populist, and there was institutionalist. That was the tribal voters. Our second group of voters is the populist group. When populists vote, they are trying to compel the government to act in accordance with their own beliefs, generally derived from a mixture of common sense, tradition, and personal experience of what is right for a government to do. Populist voters are people who genuinely believe in democracy. They believe that the way Washington works is that the people elect a president who runs the country. I once had an email exchange with a very successful and quite erudite populist political blogger who did not understand that President Bush cannot fire a State Department employee just because that employee is openly trying to sabotage White House initiatives. This is an excellent example of the level of complete structural misconception that a populist voter can entertain when attempting to vote. If populists had any idea at all of how Washington actually works, they would not continue to participate in the increasingly farcical elections by which they repeatedly endorse it. And remember, he's writing this in 2008. This is before the Trump era. This was before the Obama era. This was back in the Bush era that he was identifying all of this. This is when I read about this, a quite erudite populist political blogger who did not understand that President Bush cannot fire a State Department employee just because that employee is openly trying to sabotage White House initiatives. I'm sure it was someone like at National Review. That's exactly those types of guys. The establishment Republicans are this completely dense and do not understand whatsoever the nature of the system that they're actually so embedded in and invested in. That's very, very common among the establishment GOP. It's not so common among the Dems. The Dems generally very well understand the nature of the system. The fact of the matter is that Washington, as it exists today, 21st century Washington, is designed to resist populist politics in roughly the same way that a lighthouse is designed to resist waves. The entire thrust of 20th century American government has been to separate public policy from politics, i.e., to eliminate the menace of democracy. If you read about what American politics was a century ago, this program, originally the program of the Mugwumps, and then of various flavors of liberal and progressive, including, of course, the New Deal, is perfectly understandable. With a century ago, he links to Richard Croker, who is known as Boss Croker. He was an American politician who was a leader of New York City's Tammany Hall and a political boss. He was born November 1843, died in 1922. Basically he was just a power broker, a political power broker. And the Mugwumps were they were Republican political activists in the United States who were intensely opposed to political corruption. They were never formally organized. Typically, they switched parties from the Republican Party by supporting Democratic candidate Grover Cleveland in the presidential election of 1884. They switched because they rejected the long history of corruption associated with Republican candidate James G. Blaine. In a close election, the Mugwumps claimed they made the difference in New York State and swung the election to Cleveland. The jocular word mugwump, noted as early as 1832, is from Algonquian mugwump, which means important person or kingpin or war leader, implying that they were sanctimonious or holier than thou and holding themselves aloof from party politics. After the election, mugwumps survived for more than a decade as an epithet for a party bolter in American politics. Many mugwumps became Democrats or remained independents, and most continued to support reform well into the 20th century. During the third party system, party loyalty was in high regard and independents were rare. Theodore Roosevelt stunned his upper-class New York City friends by supporting Blaine in 1884. By rejecting the Mugwumps, he kept alive his Republican Party leadership, clearing the way for his own political aspirations. New England and the Northeast had been a stronghold of the Republican Party since the Civil War era, but the Mugwumps considered Blaine to be an untrustworthy and fraudulent candidate. Their idealism and reform sensibilities led them to oppose the political corruption and the politics of the Gilded Age. And that's basically what the progressive era was born out of them, out of the Mugwumps. And so then that's where out of the progressive era was born the New Deal. And we live in the New Deal era today. One thing Moldbug identifies is that there's been multiple, I think he says there's either been 4 or 5 constitutions of the United States. That the written constitution that we traditionally, the Constitution of 1776, is very unusual in world history in that it's a written constitution. Almost by definition, most constitutions are unwritten. And that it only lasted it lasted for a very short period of time. It was just like the first up until the Civil War or even before then. And then from the Civil War to the New Deal era was another constitution. And then from the New Deal era to now has been another constitution. And we're right on the cusp. It happens every 80 years or so, 70 to 90 years. There's a cycle. And you get some sort of a king-like figure who basically trashes the old Constitution and ushers in a new one. And that is the Constitution that effectively actually governs us. So we're pretty much due for that. And it seems like that's kind of what Joe Biden has been put into office to do, to be like a new FDR. What I'm expecting is that whoever comes after Joe Biden is going to be that character, whether that's on the establishment side or some sort of populist side. Okay, so this is the populist voter. The first was the tribal voter. This is the populist voter. So if you read about what American politics was a century ago, this program of eliminating the menace of democracy by separating public policy from politics, which was originally the program of the Mugwumps, and then of various flavors of liberal and progressive, including, of course, the New Deal, is perfectly understandable because politics used to be just incredibly corrupt. It was where organized crime and politics became the same thing. The problem is basically solved. Populist resistance, a la Poujadisme, which is Pierre Poujade, who was a French populist position after whom the Poujadist movement was named. He lived 1920 to 2003. Populist resistance, a la Poujadisme, no longer exists in Washington's test facilities in Western Europe, now governed largely by a central administration which has no discernible ties to any democratic election. At present, the primary distinction between the EU and the late Soviet Union is that the latter was much more Russian, thus exhibiting a mixture of incompetence and brutality that is hard to duplicate west of the Elbe. But give it a few years. Basically, the EU is a new form of the Soviet Union. Populism still has a solid position in the American political system, but it is fading rapidly, as is the importance of politics. The Obama administration seems set to be an almost entirely ceremonial one. At least the presidential elect has displayed no strong evidence of any fixed opinions on any subject. Even the populism of the Bush administration is greatly overstated. A significant minority of the American foreign policy establishment supported the invasion of Iraq, which was neither an explosion of jingoist fervor, nor the president's personal whim, nor the conspiracy of some Texan deep state. It's interesting there that he was predicting the fading of populism right before there was a big explosion of populism. One thing you'll find out about Moldbug is that he's pretty bad at predicting the future, but he's very good at describing the past. The basic advantage of populism is that if the claimed virtues of democracy are anywhere, they are here. Common sense and plain thinking in a reasonably intelligent brain are remarkably immune to the ethereal delusions that so easily infect the brilliant and educated. However, common sense cannot exist without tradition. The best traditions of the American populist voter are steadily being eroded by an educational system that populists do not control, and his worst traditions are steadily being exacerbated by churches and talk radio networks that populists do control. The entire political structure of the American populist tradition is set up to select for ignorance and stupidity, and select against organization and cohesion. Thus, it is simultaneously undesirable and ineffective, and even those of us who, like myself, sympathize with it to a considerable degree, are often slightly relieved to see it lose, as it always does. Even when populists win presidential elections, they simply have no way to control Washington. Even with Congress and the presidency, the White House has no real authority over the civil service, who, outside the military, are institutionalist by definition. This was very good foresight. This is what he's describing here is what happened with Trump. The Republicans had Congress and the presidency, and the White House still had no real authority over the civil service. The Reagan Revolution started out as a populist tsunami designed to smash the New Deal, and turned into nothing at all. Nixon's silent majority met an even more inglorious fate. At most, a few token populist policies can be advanced. Populists can, of course, disrupt the institutional bowels of the state, leading to a sort of policy constipation, but like the old House of Lords, their only real power is to delay. Since populists have no idea of any of this, they participate enthusiastically in the sham. Sometimes they win a little, but in the end, they always lose. And they are such gentlemen about it, too. Somehow no one has ever explained to Middle America that if you don't know who the sucker at the table is, the sucker is you. And finally, we come to our ruling class, the institutionalists. Institutionalism, as previously mentioned, is an essentially aristocratic belief system. The institutionalist voter votes not because she believes government policies should be decided at the ballot box, but because she believes they shouldn't. Rather, she believes that government policies should be determined by a set of official and quasi-official agencies which have earned her trust permanently and completely, the way a good Catholic trusts the Vatican. Following the analogy, here at UR we refer to this meta-institution as the cathedral. And he says, there's a footnote, and it says, this terminology is not meant to disparage real cathedrals. The main rhetorical point is that members of the cathedral are, despite their avowed secularism and faux egalitarianism, in effect a theocratic priestly class. The cathedral consists of the educational organs, public schools, the universities, and the press. And then a footnote says the entertainment industry arguably belongs on this list as well. Its spires are the Ivy League and the New York Times, whose faculty and news desk, respectively, are endowed with an almost pure connection to the inner light, lesser institutions, of course, following their lead. The inner light was a phrase commonly used within the Religious Society of Friends, or the Quakers, as metaphors for Christ's light shining on or in them. One thing he points out in different places is the effect that Quakerism in the United States, how it influenced progressive politics that descended from it, that a lot of modern American politics flowed through the Quakers. It is not that the institutionalist voter does not believe in democracy. She does believe in democracy. She believes passionately in democracy. But her democracy is very different from the democracy of her mortal enemy, the populist. To the institutionalist, the way democracy works is that democracy depends on the educated voter. The voter is to be educated by institutionalists, of course, because institutionalists are right. Some level of ignorance and recalcitrance can be expected, and there will always be dissent, but through this cycle of education and election, we are always advancing into the future. The reason we have elected officials is not so that they can manage the government, a task which must, of course, be left to the experts, who are institutionalists, of course. Rather, officials such as the president are essentially educational figures, participating in a public discourse in which the bully pulpit, an oddly revealing term, delivers further education. In turn, by electing a good president, the voters demonstrate the depth of their educated wisdom. Und so weiter. I don't know what that means. It looks like it's German. Let's look it up and see. Und so weiter means and so forth and so on. That description there is one of the best of the modern ruling class. Their perspective, when they talk about democracy, what they're meaning is not government of the people, by the people, for the people. What they're meaning is government for the people. And your role in an election is to, it's like a test that's held quarterly to indicate that you are properly absorbing the instruction that you've been given by the experts. This is why now experts are everywhere. Everything is all about the experts. If you look at headlines, it'll say such and such, so and so, according to experts, or experts say, or experts confirm. Everything is all about the experts, because experts in this, to the institutionalist, are what a priest was to a good Catholic centuries ago. They serve the exact same function. Their job is to direct the people in how to vote, to confirm that they're embodying the values they've been instructed to embody, which is the role of the government. The role of the government is to train and to instruct and to coach and then to provide for its people. It's a very maternal picture of the government. And so when you try to attack them and say, well, democracy is mob rule or whatever, it doesn't even compute for them. You're using a completely different definition of the term. To them, when they describe democracy, this is what they're thinking of, is this role by which the experts inculcate proper values according to the oracles of the gods, which is the capital S science. They inculcate those values into the populace. The populace responds by voting the way they've been instructed to vote, and that's confirmation that everything is working as it should, and that's what democracy is. And if you're trying to engage with those people on any sort of level, you're out of your mind. You might as well be trying to talk a Catholic out of being a Catholic, or trying to convince a Catholic that the Pope is the Antichrist. They're not even going to listen to you. You are 100% out of your depth in that conversation.
Know what I'm an expert at?
What?
Dancing.
Paloma Verde.
I got to go teach it now.
Oh, yeah, you got to go.
I do.
Yep. All right, sounds good.
Go. All right, fans, promo code
sure,
King with Paloma Verde.
Yeah, make sure you use your green Paloma.
Absolutely.
All right, buddy. We'll talk to you later.
Toodles.
Okay. Okay. Note the function of populist and tribal voters in the institutionalist mind. The populist electorate supplies the boogeyman. The fear of a populist takeover, which is theoretically always a possibility and has even happened once or twice in history, Nazi Germany, can keep even the most jaded of institutionalist voters coming back to the polls, even though it never seems to actually happen. Moreover, the populists are barraged by a flood of institutionalist messages more or less from birth to death. They are naturally resistant, but the programming wears them down over time. Meanwhile, the tribals, who are votes for rent, will always support the institutionalist bloc, and may even make up a majority of their support, though at a certain level this becomes dangerous. Their votes are guaranteed in exchange for permanent government programs administered by institutionalists that render them dependent on the cathedral's rule for their lives and livelihoods. As for the institution itself, the cathedral, it is, except in its majestic extent and intricacy, not unusual by any historical standard. The cathedral is a selective aristocracy, which is more or less the way China was run for about 2,500 years. It is also the way the Soviet Union was run, the way the Catholic Church was run, the way China today is run, and the way Nazi Germany probably would have been run if we still had a Nazi Germany to kick around. As in all these institutions, rank and place in it is in high demand, and those who rise to the top are men and women of no mean capacity. However, there is just one little problem. The cathedral is not responsible. At least, if it is responsible, we cannot detect any mechanism by which it is responsible. Okay, hold on just a sec. I got to get another drink. Popular Liberty says, Matt, send me a link. Let me take over for Steve. I already have my shirt off. We'll have to try that sometime. We'll have a guest host one of these times if Steven can't show up. Or maybe if I can't show up, you can guest host with Steven. Okay, there's one little problem. The cathedral is not responsible. At least if it is responsible, we cannot detect any mechanism by which it is responsible. What compels the cathedral to devise and promulgate good and effective policies rather than evil or counterproductive ones? If there is an answer to this question, I cannot discern it. If there is an external or internal mechanism which can correct any errors which may occur in the cathedral, for example, a completely corrupt and meretricious field of learning, a discipline of institutionalized crackpottery, as Lysenko created in Russia, I cannot find it. I cannot even identify some reserved power which can remove the cathedral if it goes completely off the rails. Certainly nothing short of a titanic populist explosion or a military coup can dislodge institutionalism for good. The first cure may be worse than the disease, and the second is a complete unknown and shows no signs of being a real possibility. So the titanic populist explosion may be worse than the disease of institutionalism, and a military coup is a complete unknown and shows no signs of being a real possibility. And while the cathedrals, and that is a word I do not know. Hold on. We're going to look this up. Archaic, of course. A person believed to be possessed by a devil or a spirit. It's energumen. Yeah, energumen. Huh. And while the cathedral's energumens, levels 1 and 2 are in concert, hold their lock on power, it is free to go as far off the rails as it wants. Thus, there is no responsibility. The chain of guardians stretches up to Harvard, where it is tied to nothing and is guarded by itself. So who watches the watchers? The watchers watch the watchers. Consider the possibility, for example, that the people we call economists, in fact, know nothing at all about economics. And he links to Emperors, Clothes, etc. by Arnold Kling on the Econlog blog. Is this far-fetched? After 2008, can we call this far-fetched? And if it isn't, what other worms are in your brain? And that is the end of Chapter 3. So our next episode, on Thursday, we will be covering Chapter 4, which is a reactionary theory of world peace. This will be a very, very fun one, and it looks like it's about the same length as the other. Okay, so we've got a couple minutes here, and I'll just catch up on the comments here, which are, looks like mostly Popular Liberty, which is great. These are some of the best conversations happening here. So, the Golden Globes got canceled. That's fantastic. The right-wing fire rises. Even the CCP is launching a massive pro-police PR campaign. Even the commies still have to be somewhat beholden to PR. Yeah, that's very true. It's interesting watching the CCP. I think that we're going to start seeing more and more. If the CCP was smart, which I know that they are, we're going to start seeing more and more rhetoric out of them that sounds very similar to like traditional conservative American patriotism. They're going to start appealing to those sorts of traditional values. Because those are the people who are the most skeptical and most concerned about China. And it's in their best interest to continue to rise and advance that the U.S. put up the least fight possible as the U.S. empire is declining. So I think that they're going to probably start appealing to traditional American values and talk about their freedom and their liberty and start. I mean, there's already been this stuff about how they're shooting down a lot of the wokeism, the woke progressive agenda. They're shooting down a lot of that. So because culturally, in a lot of ways, they're very conservative, but they're communists. They have a communist economic system. But I posted something on Facebook. I need to go find it a couple years ago where I said, over the next decade, we're going to watch China and America moving toward each other. They're both going to be moving toward the same point where China is becoming more like America and America is becoming more like China. And I think I don't know exactly in what sense that's going to be. It can happen in a number of different senses, but I predicted that a couple years ago and I stand by that. I think that's the direction that we're heading. And I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing necessarily, but I think in general, it's probably going to be a fairly good thing. And yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't really have much more thoughts on that beyond that point, but it'll be interesting to watch. So, high time preference is a signature of man-made religions. Good point. John Hartman says, we don't have to go further than the late 1930s for private charity to be the norm. Popular Liberty brings up the anti-tax. We'll talk about the anti-tax at some point. I think it'll be very interesting to hear you guys, to get you guys, let you guys hear about it and see what your opinion is. Popular Liberty says it's far better to channel the rabble's high time preference impulses for good works with a form of direct democracy rather than have them play tug of war with the sovereign, which is a guessing game no one wins. This keeps them arguing with each other rather than with the sovereign, which is much more efficient. Erdogan. Oh yeah, Erdogan, he arrested the generals who would have overthrown him. That's a pretty brilliant way to flush out the people you can't trust. Have a false coup and wait to see who jumps on the side of the people going against you. But actually, you were the one that coordinated the whole time. You're like, all right, well, you guys just revealed yourselves as the people I can't trust, so you're out of here. Peter Zeihan has an entire chapter about Erdogan in his latest book, Disunited Nations. He says Erdogan is probably going to invade Greece and try to take Cyprus. That would give him control of the sea lanes, which Turkey had for centuries until he developed deep water navigation to avoid them. Juan says Indonesians are the absolute most based in the world. Popular Liberty says it floors me that Moldbug was this far ahead of his time. Juan says Moldbug says U.S. picks an absolute monarchist every 70 years. New Deal came roughly 70 years after Lincoln. Yeah, absolutely. We referenced that. The major structural design of the Constitution has remained mostly unchanged. The more minor speed bump structures of the Constitution have changed wildly. Major structural roadblocks are the 50 states, legislative corruption, and geography. Minor speed bumps are like the Bill of Rights and delegated powers. And ultimately, the reason that the Second Amendment has continued to exist and continued to bear some sort of power is not because of the powers that be and their respect for the Constitution. It's because it's easier to just retain it, act like it's there. Hey, we haven't touched the Second Amendment. It's still there. We've just added these sensible gun control laws. So if the people who wrote the Bill of Rights saw the state of gun legislation in the country, gun laws in the country today, they'd be like, what do you even have a Second Amendment for? It hardly means anything anymore. So formally, the Second Amendment there is. Formally, we have our rights to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But informally, practically, in actual fact, they're like nothing compared to what they used to be, because this is the way that it functions. So if you have a written constitution, it really doesn't. It's like, whatever, it's there. And if anything, the written constitution is almost worse because it gives you the impression that the Constitution still exists. It's like, oh, this is the Constitution we're still governed by. But we're not governed by the formal Constitution. We're governed by the informal Constitution. And if the formal Constitution wasn't there, it would be much clearer what we're actually governed by. The informal Constitution would be much more obvious. As it is, the power structure, the powers that be, can hide behind the formal Constitution and pretend that it's still legally binding when it's functionally irrelevant. So there's a dishonesty there that creates an incentive for people to act in an unproductive way. Getting down to the bottom of the comments here. Making mistakes must have consequences for those who make them, and they need to be progressively asymmetric. That's the accountability part. The cathedral institutions, there is no accountability. If somebody, you see this countless times when there's a story that comes out, there's a big headline, it's a big trending story, everyone gets all bent out of shape about it, and then it turns out later on, the original tweet that had the faulty headline gets 50,000 retweets and millions of people see it, and then later on they issue a correction, and the correction gets 12 retweets and 5 people see, very few people see it, and there's no accountability. Nobody gets fired, nobody loses their job, nobody gets fined or arrested or flogged or anything. Nothing happens. There's no accountability. The headline governs the day, and if you have to issue an edit, you stealth edit it later on and just move on forward and just deny, and pretend it wasn't there. This is the power structure. There's no accountability. There's no responsibility. So it can't be anything but corrupt. And this is our government. Our government has no accountability process because the decision makers aren't the people who are being elected. And then people say, oh, well, just don't buy their subscriptions or don't use Twitter, don't use Facebook. That'll show them. That has no effect. If it has any effect, it takes decades to show. And by that point, it's moved on to beyond the point of relevance. It doesn't matter anymore. The purpose of people be like, oh, Twitter can't generate a return. It's not a profitable company. They're just floating it. That's because Twitter doesn't exist to be profitable. Twitter exists to coordinate the narrative. Twitter exists to function effectively as the government by conditioning people and by astroturfing social media campaigns to look to by astroturfing your activism. That's the reason that it exists. So it could cost $5 billion a day and generate $0 in revenue, and there would be people there who are willing to float it for $5 billion a day and generate no revenue, because the downstream effects of being able to control the narrative and dictate politics and policy with Twitter would be worth all of that. So when you make your entire political worldview about economics and you focus just on economic cost benefit, you miss what's actually going on. This is where libertarians and conservatives, people who obsess with the free market, this is what they miss. And not everything's about dollars and cents. And the most valuable things aren't just the making an extra buck. If you have to offload your manufacturing to another country and we save money and more people get jobs and people can buy cheaper stuff, that's not a good thing necessarily. Maybe people aren't. It doesn't suit people spiritually to be doing that kind of work. Maybe being able to get junk cheaper incentivizes people to spend their money on junk instead of spending it on others. Maybe by offloading this production, you lose your sovereignty. You lose the control of your local culture. Now you have to incorporate outside people who you don't necessarily trust, who don't share your values, but they have a say in how your culture is going to function now. You can't put a dollar value on that. So the nothing is more materialist than modern libertarians who count everything in economic impact, and they act like outsourcing trade and whatever, all these other different policies, immigration, whatever else. They just count the dollar and cents impact of it, and they say, oh, well, on net it's good because it saves money or it generates more money. That's you don't have your finger on what's actually valuable, and the things that are actually valuable are being tanked and destroyed by this kind of thing. Families are falling apart. People are losing meaning and purpose. People don't have meaningful work to do because all of it's been outsourced. There's a really interesting thing in Gray Mirror where Moldbug's newest blog, where he proposes, or he plays with this idea of outlawing the importation of plastic toys and mandating that all toys have to be made domestically and they have to be handmade wooden toys. And he plays with the downstream effects of that, what that would do culturally and socially to a country that employed that sort of policy. It's a very fascinating thought, and we'll read Gray Mirror again at some point in the future. But this is a really good point. Steven says, what was the CIA program that disappeared the day Facebook came out? I can't remember what it was called, and it would take me too long to try to come up with it right now. But yeah, there was a CIA program that was like identical to Facebook. Essentially, it had like the same effect, the same purposes, and it disappeared the day that Facebook was incorporated. It's a very, very interesting coincidence. Okay. All right, so we're just about 2 hours here, so I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you guys for showing up and for sticking it out here in the chat. And once again, if you could share this episode, share it with someone else, get it on someone else's radar so they can go through and they can get to know Moldbug and get to know the patchwork ideas, especially this episode where he breaks down the functioning of our existing government. It's a very insightful look, I think, especially for having been written over a decade ago. It's a very insightful look at the way our political system works now, and that's informative for how you should act going forward. Remember our sponsor, Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Use promo code KING. Get 25% off any order over $75. I'll have all these links in the description of the show today. You can follow me on Twitter at RealKingPilled, and follow Liberal Steve at Messina Inc. MESSINA Inc.com. We'll be back again on Thursday around 1 p.m. Pacific. We'll stream here again, and we'll read chapter 4, the final chapter. And I think that is it. We'll talk to you later, guys.